In a quiet corner of Vienna's Hütteldorf cemetery, there's a grave that most people walk right past. There's no name on it, no dates, no inscription of any kind, just a simple stone cross standing in silence among rows of ordinary headstones. You'd never guess that her birth was celebrated across an empire with cannon salutes, military parades, and torchlight processions that lit up the night sky. Her name was Elisabeth Marie Henriette Stephanie Gisela von Österreich, the only child of Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the granddaughter of Emperor Franz Joseph, the man who ruled over 50 million people for nearly 70 years. But this isn't just a story about royalty. It's not another tale of palaces and ball gowns and the glittering courts of old Europe. This is the story of a woman who watched her father take his own life when she was 5 years old. A woman who allegedly shot and killed her husband's mistress and never faced a single consequence. She had gone from being called Imperial Highness to being called Comrade, and when she wrote her final will, she made sure that almost nothing would go to her own children. Instead, she left her estate to the city of Vienna, with instructions that her land be used to build housing for working-class families. What happened to Elisabeth of Austria that transformed her so completely? What did she see? What did she survive? What did she lose that made her turn her back on the world that she was born into? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, back to a hunting lodge in the Vienna woods, where a gunshot shattered a little girl's world and set her on a path that no one could have predicted. This is the story of the Red Archduchess. On September 2nd, 1883, at Luxembourg Palace just south of Vienna, a baby girl came into the world. She was given a name that stretched across generations of royalty, Elisabeth Marie Henriette Stephanie Gisela, named after both her grandmothers, the legendary Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known to the world as Sisi, and Queen Marie Henriette of Belgium. From the moment she drew her first breath, this child was destined for greatness. Or so everyone believed. Her father was Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. Her mother was Princess Stephanie of Belgium, daughter of the notorious King Leopold II. The baby's arrival was celebrated across the realm. Within the family, they called her Erzi, the Hungarian nickname for Elisabeth, and from the very beginning, she was adored. Emperor Franz Joseph, the stern and formal ruler who kept even his own children at arm's length, made an exception for this grandchild. There was something about little Elisabeth that softened him. She would become, as he often said, his favourite. But behind the celebrations and the palace walls, something was deeply wrong. Rudolf and Stephanie's marriage had been troubled from the start. It was arranged, as royal marriages always were, for political advantage rather than love. Stephanie was just 16 when she married the 22-year-old crown prince, and she was utterly unprepared for life at the Habsburg court. Within months of the wedding, Rudolf had infected his young bride with a disease that left her unable to have more children. There would be no male heir, no son to continue the direct line of succession. Just Elisabeth. The couple began to drift apart. Rudolf threw himself into politics and intellectual pursuits, holding liberal views that put him at odds with his conservative father. He also threw himself into affairs, alcohol, and, according to some accounts, morphine. Stephanie retreated into bitterness and isolation. The palace that should have been filled with the laughter of a growing family became instead a place of cold silence and whispered resentments. Little Elisabeth grew up caught between two parents who could barely stand to be in the same room. She saw her father only occasionally, though when he did appear, he showered her with affection. She saw her mother more often, but their relationship was complicated from the start. Stephanie was distant, formal, perhaps incapable of the warmth that a child needed, and hovering over everything was the imperial court itself, rigid, suffocating, obsessed with protocol and appearances. Then came January 1889. Elizabeth was 5 years old. On the morning of January 30th, Crown Prince Rudolf was supposed to join a hunting party at his private lodge in Mayerling, a small estate nestled in the Vienna woods, about 15 miles from the capital. He had arrived the day before with a guest, a 17-year-old baroness named Mary Vetzera, with whom he had been carrying on a passionate affair. When Rudolf's valet went to wake him that morning, there was no answer. He knocked again. Nothing. Another member of the household joined him, and together they tried to force open the door. It wouldn't budge. Finally, the valet took a hammer and smashed through a wooden panel, reaching inside to unlock the door from within. What they found in that darkened room would shake the foundations of the empire. Rudolf was slumped by the bedside, blood pooling from his mouth. On the bed lay Mary Vetzera, already stiff with rigor mortis. She had been dead for hours. The Crown Prince had shot her first, then sat with her body through the night, before finally turning the gun on himself. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was dead, and the scandal that followed threatened to destroy everything. The imperial family moved fast to contain the damage. The first official announcement claimed that Rudolf had died from a heart attack, a rupture of an aneurysm. But foreign journalists were already descending on Mayerling, and within days the truth began to leak out. The story shifted. Now it was reported that Rudolf had shot himself, but only because he was mentally unbalanced. A convenient diagnosis that allowed the church to grant him a proper burial in the imperial crypt, something that would have been forbidden for a suicide. As for Mary Vetzera, she simply had to disappear. Her body was smuggled out of Mayerling in the middle of the night, propped up between two of her uncles in a carriage to make it look like she was still alive. She was buried quickly and quietly in a nearby cemetery. Her own mother wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. For weeks, the imperial court pretended that Mary had never existed at all. But rumours spread anyway. Some said it was a double suicide, a romantic pact between doomed lovers. Others whispered about murder. Perhaps Rudolf had been assassinated by political enemies, or perhaps Mary had been killed by someone else entirely, and Rudolf had taken his own life in grief. Over the years, theories multiplied: an attempted abortion gone wrong, a French plot, a jealous rival. To this day, historians still debate what really happened in that hunting lodge. What no one debated was the impact on the empire. With Rudolf gone, the direct line of succession was broken. The throne would eventually pass to Franz Joseph's nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose own assassination 25 years later would trigger the First World War. In a very real sense, the shots fired at Mayerling set in motion events that would reshape the entire world. But for 5-year-old Elisabeth, none of that mattered. All she knew was that her father was gone. The trauma of that loss would mark her for life. She had adored Rudolf, and now he had been ripped away from her without warning, without explanation. The adults around her spoke in hushed tones and careful euphemisms. The details were kept from her, but children understand more than adults realize. She knew something terrible had happened. She knew her father had done something that couldn't be spoken of, and she knew that the woman everyone blamed, at least within the family, was her own mother. Empress Elisabeth, Sisi, had never liked Stephanie. She found her daughter-in-law dull, provincial, lacking in the spark and spirit that Sisi valued above all else. After Mayerling, the Empress made no secret of her belief that Stephanie's coldness and jealousy had driven Rudolf to despair. Whether that was fair or not, the accusation hung over Stephanie like a cloud, and young Elisabeth absorbed it all. In the aftermath of Rudolf's death, Emperor Franz Joseph stepped in to take personal charge of his granddaughter's upbringing. By his direct order, Elisabeth was forbidden to leave Austria with her mother. She would be raised at court, under his watchful eye. It was partly protective. He genuinely loved the child and wanted to keep her close. But it was also a way of ensuring that Stephanie couldn't simply vanish with the last living piece of Rudolf's legacy. For Elisabeth, this meant growing up in a strange kind of limbo. She had a mother who was present, but emotionally absent. She had a grandfather who adored her, but ruled over a court so formal and rigid that genuine warmth was almost impossible. And she had the ghost of her father hanging over everything, the romantic, troubled, brilliant crown prince who had thrown it all away for reasons no one would fully explain to her. Every year on the anniversary of Mayerling, Elisabeth mourned. She mourned her father, and she mourned Mary Wetzera too, the young woman she had never met, but who had somehow become intertwined with her family's tragedy. It was a ritual she would maintain for the rest of her life, long after the empire had crumbled, long after the Habsburgs had been swept from power. She never forgot. Then, in 1900, her mother made a decision that shattered what little relationship they had left. Stephanie announced that she was remarrying. Her new husband was a Hungarian count named Mayerling, a man of lower rank who was not considered appropriate for a widowed crown princess. By marrying him, Stephanie would have to give up her position within the Habsburg dynasty. She would no longer be a member of the imperial family. She would lose her status, her allowance, her place at court, and she did it anyway. For Elisabeth, now 16 years old, this was the ultimate betrayal. In her mind, her mother had already failed Rudolf, had driven him to despair with her coldness and complaints. Now, Stephanie was abandoning the dynasty entirely, throwing away the Habsburg name for the sake of some minor nobleman. The two women stopped speaking. Their estrangement would last for the rest of their lives. Stephanie died in 1945, and by then, mother and daughter hadn't had a real relationship in over 4 decades. Elisabeth was now, in many ways, alone. Her father was dead. Her grandmother Sisi had been assassinated by an anarchist in 1898, stabbed through the heart while walking along the shores of Lake Geneva. The only constant in her life was her grandfather, the aging emperor who had ruled for so long that most of his subjects couldn't remember anyone else on the throne. Franz Joseph gave Elisabeth everything he could: money, jewels, estates, the finest education the empire could provide. When Sisi died, her will specified that her personal property, her jewellery, her possessions, the intimate items that had belonged to the legendary empress, should go to Elisabeth. It was an enormous inheritance, and it came with an unspoken message: you are Rudolf's daughter, and that still means something. But all the wealth in the world couldn't fill the void that Mayerling had left behind. By the time Elisabeth reached her late teens, she was already showing signs of the rebellious spirit that would define her life. She chafed against the rigid protocols of the court. She resented being treated like a porcelain doll to be displayed and eventually married off for political advantage. She had opinions, strong ones, and she wasn't afraid to voice them. Most of all, she wanted what Mayerling had taken from her: the freedom to choose her own path, the freedom to love whom she wanted, live how she wanted, be who she wanted. And soon she would find a way to seize it, even if it meant defying the most powerful man in Europe. By the autumn of 1900, Elisabeth was 17 years old and already one of the most talked about young women in Europe. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, which was remarkable for a woman of that era, with striking features and an imperious bearing that reminded people of her grandmother Sisi. She was also wealthy beyond measure. The inheritance from Sisi, combined with her father's estate and the generous allowances provided by Franz Joseph, made her one of the richest heiresses on the continent. Royal families across Europe had taken notice. Here was the granddaughter of Emperor Franz Joseph, the only child of the tragic Crown Prince Rudolf, a young woman of impeccable lineage and enormous fortune. Surely she would make a brilliant match. Surely she would marry into one of the great ruling houses and cement alliances that would benefit the Habsburg dynasty for generations to come. Franz Joseph certainly thought so. He had plans for Elisabeth, grand plans that involved the most eligible bachelor in Europe at the time, Crown Prince Wilhelm of Germany, the eldest son of Kaiser Wilhelm II and heir to the German throne. A marriage between Elisabeth and Wilhelm would unite the two great German-speaking empires, creating a bond between the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns that could reshape the balance of power across the continent. It was, by any measure, a spectacular opportunity. Wilhelm would one day be Kaiser. Elisabeth would be Empress of Germany. Their children would inherit both the German and, potentially, the Austrian thrones. Diplomats salivated at the prospect. There was just one problem. Elisabeth had other ideas. In September of 1900, at a ball held in one of Vienna's glittering palaces, she met a man who was decidedly not the German Crown Prince. His name was Otto zu Windisch-Graetz, and he was a military officer from an old Austrian noble family. The Windisch-Graetz clan was distinguished enough. They had been princes for generations and had served the Habsburgs with loyalty, but they were nowhere near the level of a ruling dynasty. In the rigid hierarchy of European royalty, Otto was what they called not of equal birth. A marriage between him and a granddaughter of the emperor would be considered morganatic, unequal, unsuitable, a step down. None of that mattered to Elisabeth. From the moment she saw Otto, she was captivated. He was handsome, 10 years older than her, with the confident bearing of a career military man. Whether it was genuine love or simply the thrill of wanting something she wasn't supposed to have, Elisabeth decided almost immediately that Otto zu Windisch-Graetz was the man she was going to marry. The fact that Otto was already engaged to someone else didn't seem to concern her. When Elisabeth informed her grandfather of her intentions, Franz Joseph was horrified. This was not how things were done. Imperial princesses did not fall in love at balls and announce their marriage plans like common shopgirls. There were negotiations to consider, treaties to examine, dynastic implications to weigh. And besides, what about Crown Prince Wilhelm? What about the Grand Alliance with Germany? Elisabeth didn't care about Germany. She didn't care about alliances or treaties or the future of the Habsburg dynasty. She wanted Otto, and she intended to have him. What followed was a battle of wills between a teenage girl and the most powerful monarch in Central Europe. Franz Joseph tried everything. He reasoned with her. He reminded her of her duty. He pointed out that Wilhelm was heir to an empire, while Otto was merely a prince of a minor noble house. He imposed a mandatory reflection period, hoping that time would cool her infatuation and bring her to her senses. Weeks passed, then months. The court watched in astonishment as the emperor's favourite granddaughter refused to bend. This was unprecedented. No one defied Franz Joseph. The man had ruled for over 50 years. He had survived assassination attempts, wars, family tragedies, and political upheavals. He was accustomed to being obeyed without question. But Elisabeth had inherited something from her father, that same stubborn streak, that same refusal to accept the path that others had laid out for her. Rudolf had chafed under his father's authority too. He had wanted reform, liberalization, a different kind of empire. He had been denied at every turn, and the frustration had contributed to his destruction. Now his daughter was fighting her own battle against the same immovable force. Eventually, Franz Joseph did something he almost never did. He gave in. Perhaps he was tired of the struggle. Perhaps he couldn't bear to see Elisabeth unhappy, this last living piece of his beloved Rudolf. Perhaps he recognized that forcing her into an unwanted marriage would only breed resentment and misery. Whatever the reason, the emperor relented. Elisabeth could marry Otto zu Windisch-Graetz, but there would be conditions. First, Otto had to break off his existing engagement, a humiliation for the woman he had promised to marry, and a scandal in its own right. The emperor essentially forced Otto into the match, sending him a formal letter of congratulations before Otto had even properly agreed. It was a fait accompli. Otto would marry Elisabeth whether he wanted to or not. Second, Elisabeth would have to renounce her place in the Habsburg line of succession. By marrying beneath her station, she was removing herself from the dynasty. She would no longer be an archduchess in the full sense of the word. She would give up any claim to the throne, any right to the family's emergency funds, any official role in the imperial family's future. For most royal women, this would have been an unbearable sacrifice. Their entire identity was wrapped up in their position, their titles, their place in the hierarchy. To surrender all of that for a man, and not even a particularly impressive man by royal standards, would have seemed like madness. Elisabeth didn't hesitate. She signed away her birthright without a second thought. The wedding took place on January 23, 1902, in the chapel of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. Elisabeth was 18 years old. Otto was 28. By all accounts, it was a lavish ceremony befitting the granddaughter of the emperor, even if the groom wasn't quite what anyone had hoped for. The bride wore the magnificent jewels she had inherited from her grandmother Sisi, including the famous diamond stars that Sisi had worn in her legendary portraits. After the ceremony, Elisabeth reportedly said something that would echo through the rest of her life. She told those close to her that she finally felt free. For the first time ever, she was out from under the crushing weight of the imperial court. No more rigid protocols, no more being watched and judged and evaluated, no more waiting to be traded like a chess piece in someone else's game. She had won. She had defied the Emperor of Austria-Hungary and gotten exactly what she wanted. But freedom, as Elisabeth was about to discover, was more complicated than she had imagined, because the man she had fought so hard to marry didn't actually want her. Otto zu Windisch-Graetz had been forced into this union against his will, compelled to abandon the woman he had loved for the granddaughter of an emperor who had given him no choice, and he would spend the rest of their marriage making Elisabeth pay for it. The fairy tale was over before it had even begun. Within months of the wedding, rumours began circulating through Viennese society. Otto was seen with other women. He made no effort to hide his affairs, flaunting them almost deliberately, as if to punish his wife for trapping him in a marriage he had never wanted. Elisabeth, who had sacrificed everything for love, found herself in a union that was loveless from the start. She could have accepted it quietly, as so many aristocratic women did. Infidelity among the nobility was practically expected. Husbands strayed, wives looked the other way, and everyone maintained the pretense of a happy marriage for the sake of appearances. That was how things were done. But Elisabeth was not like other aristocratic women. She had her father's temper and her grandmother's pride. She was not going to suffer in silence while her husband paraded his mistresses through the salons of Prague and Vienna. She was going to do something about it, and what she did next would become one of the most whispered about scandals in Habsburg history. The couple had barely been married a year when Otto began a particularly brazen affair with an actress in Prague. Her name was Louise Ziegler. Some sources call her Marie Ziegler, and she was by all accounts a striking woman. Slender, beautiful, talented on stage. She performed at one of the prestigious theatres in Prague, and half the young noblemen in the city were said to be infatuated with her, including Otto. He didn't even try to be discreet about it. He visited her openly, showered her with attention, made her his mistress in full view of Prague society. Word filtered back to Vienna, as it always did. The gossips whispered, the newspapers hinted. Everyone knew that the granddaughter of the emperor was being publicly humiliated by her own husband. Elisabeth seethed. What happened next has been told and retold for over a century, and the details vary depending on the source. But the core of the story remains consistent across all accounts, and it's explosive. Elisabeth learned that Otto was with his mistress at a particular address in Prague. She armed herself with a gold-mounted revolver that had been a gift from Otto himself, some accounts say, and went to confront them. When she arrived, Otto's valet blocked her path. He stood in front of the bedroom door, trying to prevent her from entering, caught between his loyalty to his master and the fury of a woman who happened to be one of the highest-ranking people in the empire. Elisabeth raised the revolver and fired. The valet fled. Whether the shot missed him or merely frightened him, he wasn't staying around to find out. The path was clear. Elisabeth burst through the bedroom door and found what she expected to find, her husband and his mistress. What happened in the next few moments is where the accounts diverge. Some say there was a struggle. Some say Otto tried to intervene. What everyone agrees on is that Elisabeth raised her weapon and shot Louise Ziegler in the chest. The actress collapsed. Otto was horrified. Servants came running. There was blood everywhere. And then, according to multiple sources, Elisabeth broke down crying. Here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. Louise Ziegler didn't die immediately. She was seriously wounded, and she was taken away for medical treatment. But the wound was severe, and in an era before antibiotics, before modern surgical techniques, such injuries were often fatal. According to the testimony of contemporaries, including a well-connected gossip named George Greville Moore, who wrote about Vienna's high society, Louise Ziegler eventually died from the wound Elisabeth had inflicted. The granddaughter of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary had shot and killed her husband's mistress, and nothing happened to her. No arrest, no trial, no public scandal. The entire incident was hushed up with breathtaking efficiency. The imperial family closed ranks. Palms were greased, mouths were shut, and the official record was scrubbed clean. A few society papers made oblique references to an incident in Prague, but nothing concrete ever appeared in print. The only sign that anything had happened at all came from the emperor himself. When Elisabeth gave birth to her second child, a son named Ernst, born in 1905, Franz Joseph pointedly refused to attend the baptism. For a man who adored his granddaughter, who had indulged her every whim, this was an extraordinary rebuke. It was his silent way of acknowledging what everyone knew, but no one would say. Elisabeth had gone too far. George Greville Moore, writing years later, described the aftermath with the dry understatement typical of the era. The whole affair caused a painful sensation at the court in Vienna, he noted, though it has been hushed up as most events of the kind are. Most events of the kind, as if aristocratic women shooting their husbands' mistresses were just another routine occurrence to be managed and forgotten. For Elisabeth, the shooting changed nothing and everything. Her marriage continued, if you could call it that. She and Otto remained legally bound to each other, living in the same houses, appearing at the same functions, but their relationship was a hollow shell. Both of them began conducting affairs openly, no longer even pretending to maintain appearances. They had 4 children together: Franz Joseph, born in 1904, Ernst, born in 1905, Rudolf, born in 1907, and Stephanie, born in 1909. 4 children conceived in a marriage that was dead in everything but name. The household was a battlefield, with servants caught between 2 warring factions and the children growing up amid constant tension. In 1911, Elisabeth bought Schönau Castle, a beautiful estate in Lower Austria, about 20 miles south of Vienna. It became her refuge, the one place where she could escape from Otto and the suffocating atmosphere of their shared life. She threw herself into renovating it, making it her own, creating a world where she could finally breathe. But Elisabeth was lonely. She was still young, not yet 30, wealthy, passionate, and trapped in a loveless marriage that showed no signs of ending. In the rigid Catholic Austria of the early 20th century, divorce was essentially impossible. The Church controlled marriage law, and what God had joined together, no court could put asunder. Elisabeth was stuck with Otto until one of them died, and then, in 1913, she met someone who made her feel alive again. His name was Egon Lurch. They met in Pola, a naval port on the Adriatic coast of Istria, where Elisabeth had taken to spending her winters to get away from Otto. Lurch was a young naval officer, a Linienschiffsleutnant, or ship-of-the-line lieutenant, just 28 years old, handsome, ambitious, and utterly charming. He came from Trieste, spoke multiple languages, and had the dashing confidence that military men of that era cultivated like a uniform. What exactly happened between them is difficult to know for certain. The official sources described their relationship as at least a friendship. But everyone who knew them understood it was more than that. In an era when married women simply did not form close attachments to young military officers unless something deeper was involved, Elisabeth and Egon were seen together constantly. They wrote letters. They met whenever she was in Istria. The connection between them was obvious to anyone paying attention. For Elisabeth, Egon represented everything Otto was not. He was kind where Otto was cruel. He was attentive where Otto was neglectful. He was genuinely interested in her thoughts, her feelings, her dreams. After years of being trapped in a marriage that brought her nothing but misery, she had finally found someone who made her feel valued. There was just one problem. Actually, there were several. Egon was not of noble birth. He was a naval officer from a respectable family, but he was nowhere near the social level required to marry a granddaughter of the emperor. Even if Elisabeth could somehow obtain a divorce, which was virtually impossible, she could never marry Egon without causing another massive scandal. The relationship had no future. They both knew it, but that didn't stop them. Then came 1914, and the world exploded. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the same Franz Ferdinand who had become heir to the throne after Elisabeth's father Rudolf died at Mayerling, triggered a chain reaction that plunged all of Europe into war. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary was fighting Serbia. Germany joined on Austria's side. Russia mobilized. France and Britain were drawn in. The great powers that had maintained an uneasy peace for decades were suddenly tearing each other apart. Egon Lurch was called to active duty. He was given command of U-12, one of the Austro-Hungarian Navy's submarines. It was a small vessel, just 250 tons, with a crew of about 24 men and all the limitations of early submarine technology: unreliable engines, limited diving depth, batteries that filled the hull with toxic fumes when recharged. But Egon was determined to prove himself, and prove himself he did. In December 1914, Egon pulled off one of the most daring attacks of the naval war. He manoeuvred U-12 through heavily patrolled waters and fired a torpedo at the Jean Bart, the flagship of the French fleet in the Mediterranean. The torpedo struck. The massive battleship was badly damaged, and the French admiral was forced to withdraw his entire fleet from the Adriatic Sea. It was a stunning victory, and overnight, Egon Lurch became a hero. The newspapers celebrated him. The Navy decorated him. He was compared to the great German submarine aces. For a brief shining moment, Egon Lurch was one of the most famous men in Austria-Hungary, but there was something else driving him, something beyond patriotism or military ambition. According to some accounts, Egon believed that if he could distinguish himself sufficiently, if he could win the Maria Theresa military order, the highest honour the empire could bestow, he would be ennobled. He would become a nobleman. And then, perhaps, he might be considered worthy of marrying a granddaughter of the emperor. It was a fantasy, probably. Even with a title, the obstacles between him and Elisabeth were enormous. But love makes people believe in impossible things. He never got the chance to find out. On August 7, 1915, Egon Lurch took U-12 out of Trieste on what would be his final mission. His target was the port of Venice, where the Italian navy kept its main fleet. Italy had recently entered the war against Austria-Hungary, and Egon was determined to strike a blow against the new enemy. He never reached Venice. Somewhere near the island of Malamocco, at the entrance to the Venetian lagoon, U-12 struck a mine. The explosion tore the submarine apart. There were no survivors. Egon Lurch and his entire crew went down with the vessel, their bodies entombed in the wreckage on the seafloor. The Italians recovered the submarine over a year later, in December 1916. They identified Egon's body by the medals still pinned to his uniform, including an Italian life-saving medal he had won years earlier before the two countries became enemies. He was buried with his crew in the cemetery of San Michele in Venice. He was 29 years old. For Elisabeth, the news must have been devastating. She had already lost her father to violence, her grandmother to an assassin's blade. Now the man she loved had been swallowed by the sea, killed in a war that was consuming an entire generation. And the war was far from over. It would drag on for 3 more years, killing millions, destroying empires, and sweeping away the world that Elisabeth had been born into. By the time it ended, everything she had known would be gone. The First World War was supposed to be over by Christmas. That's what they told the soldiers marching off in their gleaming uniforms in the summer of 1914. A quick campaign, a decisive victory, and everyone home in time for the holidays. Instead, the war ground on for 4 years, devouring men and treasure on a scale the world had never seen. For Elisabeth, the war years were a slow-motion catastrophe. Egon was dead. Her marriage was a wasteland. Her children were growing up in a household poisoned by their parents' hatred for each other. And all around her, the empire that had defined her entire existence was beginning to crack. In August 1915, just days before Egon's submarine went down, Elisabeth had finally confronted Otto about ending their marriage. She wanted a separation. She couldn't bear another day of pretending that they were husband and wife when they were really just 2 people trapped in the same prison. Otto, predictably, refused. A separation would be a scandal. It would damage his reputation, his standing, his precious honour. Better to maintain the fiction, no matter how miserable it made everyone involved. But Elisabeth had a powerful ally, her grandfather, the Emperor. In his final act of protection for his beloved granddaughter, Franz Joseph brokered a compromise between Elisabeth and Otto. They would maintain separate residences. They would no longer have to live under the same roof or pretend to be a functioning couple. The children would stay with Elisabeth, at least for the time being. It wasn't a divorce. That was still legally impossible. But it was something. A fragile peace that allowed both parties to retreat to their respective corners. Then, on November 21, 1916, Franz Joseph died. He was 86 years old. He had ruled the Austro-Hungarian Empire for 68 years, longer than any other Habsburg monarch. He had survived the execution of his brother Maximilian in Mexico, the suicide of his son Rudolf at Mayerling, the assassination of his wife Elisabeth in Geneva. He had endured wars, revolutions, and the relentless erosion of his empire's power. And now, in the middle of the greatest war in human history, he was gone. For the empire, it was a blow from which there would be no recovery. Franz Joseph's successor, the young Emperor Karl, was well-meaning but overwhelmed. He inherited a war that couldn't be won, an economy that was collapsing, and a patchwork of nationalities that were increasingly determined to go their own way. For Elisabeth, her grandfather's death meant something more personal. She had lost her protector, the one person who had always stood between her and the consequences of her actions, who had shielded her from scandal and smoothed over her mistakes, was gone. She was on her own now, and Otto was circling. The moment Franz Joseph was in his grave, Otto began making moves to reclaim control of his children. With the emperor no longer there to enforce the compromise, Otto saw an opportunity. He was still legally the head of the household. He was still the father. And in the legal system of the time, a system designed by men, for men, that meant the children belonged to him. The end of the war accelerated everything. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent on the Western Front. 2 days later, Emperor Karl renounced participation in state affairs, not quite an abdication, but close enough. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had dominated Central Europe for centuries, ceased to exist. In its place emerged a patchwork of new nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others, all carved from the carcass of the old order, and with the empire went everything that had defined Elisabeth's world. In 1919, the new Austrian Republic passed the Nobility Abolition Act. With the stroke of a pen, all aristocratic titles were eliminated. Elisabeth was no longer a princess, no longer a member of the House of Windisch-Greitz, no longer connected, at least legally, to the dynasty that had shaped her entire existence. She was simply Elisabeth Windisch-Greitz, private citizen. It was a strange kind of liberation. The titles that had defined her, constrained her, determined whom she could marry and how she could live. They were gone. But so was the protection they had offered. She was now just another woman in a country that had been devastated by war, struggling to find her footing in a world that bore no resemblance to the one she had been born into. Otto adapted to the new reality by leaving Austria altogether. He obtained Yugoslav citizenship, settling in the territory that had once been part of the empire, but was now a separate nation. And from his new base, he launched a full-scale legal assault on Elisabeth, demanding custody of their 4 children. The battle that followed would consume the next several years of Elisabeth's life. In 1920, the first round went to Otto. An Austrian court ruled that the children should be transferred to their father. Under the legal standards of the time, fathers had almost automatic rights to custody. Mothers were expected to defer, to accept, to hand over their children without protest. Elisabeth refused. When Otto's representatives came to collect the children, they encountered something unexpected. The children themselves didn't want to go. They cried, they pleaded, they physically resisted being taken away from their mother. Elisabeth produced medical documents, statements from doctors claiming that forcibly separating the children from her would cause them psychological harm. The transfer was postponed. Otto was furious. He went back to court, demanded enforcement, insisted that the law be upheld. In 1921, he obtained a new order, this one backed by the full force of the state. A judge would personally oversee the removal of the children from Schönau Castle. On the appointed day, the judicial procession arrived at Elisabeth's gates. It was an impressive show of force. The judge himself, a bailiff, and 22 gendarmes, all there to ensure that the court's order would be carried out. They marched up the road to the castle, prepared to take the children by force if necessary. What they found stopped them in their tracks. Blocking the entrance to Schönau Castle were approximately 100 workers. Local men from the surrounding villages and towns, many of them members of the Social Democratic Party, had formed a human barricade in front of the gates. They stood shoulder to shoulder, arms linked, refusing to let anyone pass. The judge was incredulous. This was a court order. This was the law. These workers had no right to interfere with the administration of justice. The workers didn't care. They knew Elisabeth. They knew she had opened her castle grounds to their children, had distributed food from her fields to their families, had treated them with a kindness that was almost unheard of from someone of her background. And they weren't going to stand by while the authorities dragged her children away. The standoff made headlines around the world. Workers block police at Austrian castle. Children of princess defended by mob. Socialist labourers defy court order. It was exactly the kind of story that newspapers loved. The granddaughter of the emperor, allied with working-class socialists, standing against the forces of law and order. The imagery was irresistible. The confrontation also became a political firestorm within Austria itself. The case was debated in the National Rat, the Austrian parliament. The Christian social government, conservative, Catholic, and generally hostile to the socialists, was furious at this act of defiance. But the Social Democrats rallied to Elisabeth's defence, pointing out the injustice of a legal system that automatically favoured fathers regardless of circumstances. Even President Michael Heinisch got involved, trying to broker some kind of resolution to a case that had become a national embarrassment. In the end, the Judicial Commission withdrew. They simply couldn't force their way through the crowd without risking a violent confrontation, and no one wanted to see blood spilled over a custody dispute. The children stayed with their mother. Otto continued to fight. He filed more motions, made more demands, tried every legal avenue available to him. But his position was weakening. He was now a Yugoslav citizen, technically a foreigner, trying to use Austrian courts to take children who lived in Austria with their Austrian mother. The optics were terrible. In 1924, the case was finally resolved. Elisabeth and Otto obtained an official separation, still not a divorce, but a legal acknowledgement that the marriage was over in all but name. The children would remain with Elisabeth. Otto would have visitation rights, but he had lost his bid to take them away. Elisabeth had won. But the battle had changed her in ways that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. The workers who had stood at her gates, who had risked arrest to protect her children, they had shown her something. They had shown her that solidarity mattered more than titles, that ordinary people acting together could stand against power and prevail, that the rigid hierarchies she had been raised to accept as natural and eternal could be challenged and overcome. She had entered the custody battle as a former archduchess, a woman of privilege who happened to have found herself in difficult circumstances. She emerged from it as something else entirely. She emerged as a socialist. For nearly 4 decades, Elisabeth had lived in a world of rigid hierarchy. She had been raised to believe that some people were simply born to rule and others were born to serve. The aristocracy existed at the top, the common people at the bottom, and that was simply the natural order of things. It was how God had arranged the world, and questioning it was as pointless as questioning the sunrise. But standing at her window that day in 1921, watching 100 ordinary men and women risk arrest to protect her family, Elisabeth saw something that shattered those assumptions. These weren't nobles, they weren't diplomats or generals or members of parliament. They were factory workers and farmers, labourers and tradesmen, people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by defying the authorities. And yet they had done it anyway. Not because they were paid to, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed it was right. That kind of solidarity was something Elizabeth had never experienced in the gilded world of the Habsburgs. At court, everyone was always calculating, always manoeuvring, always looking for advantage. Loyalty was conditional. Friendship was transactional. Even family members betrayed each other when it suited their interests. But these workers had stood together for a woman they barely knew, simply because she had shown them kindness. It made Elizabeth ask herself a question she had never considered before. What if the world she had been born into wasn't the natural order at all? What if it was simply a system designed to benefit people like her at the expense of everyone else? The answer to that question would transform the rest of her life. Elizabeth's journey towards socialism had actually begun before the custody battle, though she didn't realise it at the time. After buying Schönau Castle in 1911, she had started opening her grounds to the local community. The villages around the estate were poor, filled with workers from nearby factories and struggling farmers trying to scrape by on marginal land. The contrast between their lives and her own was stark and unavoidable. Most aristocrats would have simply ignored the poverty on their doorstep. Elizabeth did the opposite. She opened her castle gardens to the children of the local workers, giving them a place to play that wasn't a cramped apartment or a dusty street. She distributed vegetables and fruit from her fields to families who couldn't afford enough food. She hired local people for jobs on the estate, paying fair wages when other employers did not. These weren't political acts, at least not initially. Elizabeth wasn't trying to make a statement. She was simply responding to what she saw around her with basic human decency. But her generosity brought her into contact with people she never would have met in her former life. Union organisers, socialist activists, members of the Social Democratic Workers' Party who were fighting to improve conditions for Austria's working class. And then, at a voter rally in the town of Lebersdorf in 1921, she met a man who would change everything. His name was Leopold Petznek. He was a schoolteacher by training, but politics was his true calling. Leopold had risen through the ranks of the Social Democratic Party to become a member of the Lower Austrian Landtag, the regional parliament. He was 40 years old, intelligent, cultured, and deeply committed to the cause of workers' rights. He had grown up poor, worked his way through education, and dedicated his life to fighting for people who had been dealt the same difficult hand he had. He was also married. His wife had been institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital for years, suffering from a condition that would never improve. They had a son together, but the marriage existed only on paper. Leopold was, in every meaningful sense, alone. When Elizabeth met him at that rally in Lebersdorf, something clicked. Here was a man who was nothing like the aristocrats she had known all her life. He wasn't interested in titles or wealth or social position. He cared about ideas, about justice, about making the world better for people who had been forgotten by those in power. He spoke to her as an equal, not as a subject addressing royalty or a suitor angling for advantage. For Elizabeth, who had spent her entire life being treated as either a prize to be won or a problem to be managed, this was revolutionary. Leopold saw her as a person. He was interested in what she thought, what she believed, what she wanted from life. He challenged her assumptions and expanded her horizons. He introduced her to socialist theory, to the writings of Marx and Engels, to the vision of a society where birth and bloodline didn't determine your fate. They fell in love. It was, by any conventional measure, an impossible relationship. Elizabeth was the granddaughter of Emperor Franz Joseph, raised in palaces, educated by private tutors, accustomed to a life of unimaginable privilege. Leopold was a schoolteacher from a modest background, a socialist agitator, a man who would have been invisible to her just a few years earlier. The social gulf between them was vast. But the old rules didn't apply anymore. The empire was gone. The titles had been abolished. Elisabeth was no longer an archduchess. She was just a woman trying to figure out who she wanted to be. And she wanted to be with Leopold. There was just one problem. Elisabeth was still legally married to Otto. Even though they had obtained an official separation in 1924, divorce remained nearly impossible in Catholic Austria. The Church controlled marriage law, and the Church did not recognize divorce under any circumstances. Elisabeth could live apart from Otto, but she couldn't marry anyone else. Leopold, meanwhile, was still technically married to his institutionalized wife. Even though the marriage had ended in any practical sense years ago, he couldn't obtain a divorce either, for the same religious reasons that bound Elisabeth. So they did what countless couples in similar situations have done throughout history. They simply started living together. In 1929, Elisabeth sold Schönau Castle and used the proceeds to buy a villa on the outskirts of Vienna in the district of Hütteldorf. The property was known as the Windisch Greitz Villa, a name it still carries today, and it sat on a beautiful piece of land that Elisabeth had known since childhood. The area had once been part of the imperial hunting grounds, and she had visited it as a girl with her grandfather. Now it became her home with Leopold. They moved in together in 1930, openly and without apology. Vienna's high society was scandalized, of course. The granddaughter of the emperor living in sin with a socialist politician. It was an outrage. It was a disgrace. It was the final proof that Elisabeth had completely lost her mind. Elisabeth didn't care. She had spent too many years caring what other people thought. She had married the man everyone expected her to marry, and it had brought her nothing but misery. Now she was going to live the way she wanted, with the man she loved, and the gossips could say whatever they pleased. But Elisabeth wasn't content to simply live a quiet life with Leopold. She wanted to do more. She wanted to be part of the movement that had opened her eyes, that had shown her a different way of seeing the world. In October 1925, Elisabeth formally joined the Social Democratic Workers' Party, the SDAP. It was an extraordinary moment. Here was a woman who had been born into the highest ranks of European aristocracy, whose grandfather had ruled half a continent, whose ancestors had shaped the history of the Western world for centuries, and she was signing up to be a member of a socialist political party. The press had a field day. They called her the Red Archduchess. It was meant as an insult, a way of mocking her apparent betrayal of her class. But Elisabeth embraced the nickname. She wore it as a badge of honour, and she threw herself into the work. Elisabeth became active in the party's women's movement and in the Kinderfreunde, the Friends of Children, a socialist organisation that provided education and recreation for working-class kids. She attended rallies and meetings. She donated money to party causes. Every May Day, the great socialist holiday, she could be found on the streets of Vienna selling red paper carnations to raise funds for the movement. It was, to say the least, an unusual sight. Here was one of the wealthiest women in Austria, a woman who had once worn the crown jewels of the Habsburg Empire, standing on a street corner hawking flowers for a few shillings. Some of her fellow party members didn't quite know how to treat her. On more than one occasion, comrades would forget themselves and address her as Imperial Highness. Elisabeth would just laugh. In 1927, she had an encounter that would prove significant in ways she couldn't have imagined. At a party congress, she found herself sitting next to a young man barely out of his teens, a socialist activist named Bruno Kreisky. He was 16 years old, passionate about politics, and completely in awe of the elegant older woman beside him. Elisabeth brought her daughter Stephanie to the congress, and Kreisky was struck by how beautiful the young princess was. But it was Elisabeth herself who made the lasting impression. Decades later, after Kreisky had become Chancellor of Austria, the longest-serving head of government in the country's Republican history, he would still speak of that day. He remembered Elisabeth as one of the most impressive women he had ever met, elegant and sharp-minded, with a gift for cutting through pretense and getting to the heart of things. Kreisky once remarked that you could only learn real politics from two kinds of people, workers and high aristocrats. The workers understood struggle because they lived it every day, and the aristocrats understood power because they had wielded it for generations. Elisabeth, who had been born into one world and chosen another, understood both. She gave a newspaper interview in 1927 that captured her transformation perfectly. "The Social Democrats alone have helped women with action," she declared. "The future belongs to socialism." It was a remarkable statement from a woman who had grown up in the most conservative, hierarchical environment imaginable. But Elisabeth meant every word. She had seen what solidarity could accomplish. She had experienced what it meant to be supported by people who asked nothing in return. And she had found, in the socialist movement, a sense of purpose that all the wealth and privilege of her youth had never provided. The granddaughter of Franz Joseph had become a true believer. But the 1930s were coming, and with them, a darkness that would test everything Elisabeth believed in. The Austria that Elisabeth had come to love in the 1920s was a fragile thing. The young republic was barely a decade old, carved from the wreckage of an empire that had lasted centuries. It was small, landlocked, economically struggling, and deeply divided between left and right. The Social Democrats controlled Vienna. Red Vienna, they called it, transforming the capital with public housing, schools and social programs that became a model for progressives around the world. But the rest of the country remained conservative, Catholic, suspicious of the socialists and everything they represented. For a few years, the two sides managed an uneasy coexistence. But the global economic collapse of 1929 shattered whatever stability remained. Unemployment soared, banks failed, desperate people looked for someone to blame and someone to save them. Across Europe, democracy was buckling under the pressure. Mussolini had already seized power in Italy. In Germany, a failed painter with a gift for demagoguery was building a movement that would soon consume the continent. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the border. There was no resistance. Cheering crowds lined the streets as the Wehrmacht rolled into Vienna. Church bells rang. Flowers were thrown. Hitler himself arrived to a hero's welcome, greeted by hundreds of thousands of Austrians who saw him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, a native son returning in triumph. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany, was complete. For Elisabeth, this was the beginning of a nightmare. The Nazis had no patience for socialists. Former Social Democrats were rounded up. Jews were humiliated, beaten, forced to scrub the sidewalks with toothbrushes while crowds jeered. The concentration camps that had been built in Germany, Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, now received a flood of Austrian prisoners. Leopold was in immediate danger. He was a known socialist, a former parliamentarian, a man who had spent his life fighting for everything the Nazis despised. It was only a matter of time before they came for him. Elisabeth's position was more complicated. Her Habsburg blood offered some protection. The Nazis had complicated feelings about the old Austrian aristocracy, and persecuting the granddaughter of Franz Joseph might create unwanted controversy. But her socialist affiliations made her suspect, and her relationship with Leopold made her vulnerable. For 6 years they lived in a kind of suspended animation. They kept their heads down. They avoided attention. They watched as friends and comrades disappeared into the camps, never to return. They heard the rumours about what was happening in those places. the forced labour, the starvation, the casual brutality, and they waited, hoping that somehow they would survive long enough to see the nightmare end. In 1944, their luck ran out. The Gestapo came for Leopold in August of that year. The war was turning against Germany, the Allies had landed in Normandy, the Soviets were pushing west, and the Nazi regime was growing more paranoid and vicious by the day. Old enemies were being settled, scores were being paid, and Leopold Petznek, the socialist teacher who had spent a decade in quiet defiance, was finally dragged from his home. They sent him to Dachau. Dachau was one of the first concentration camps the Nazis had built, established in 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power. It had started as a prison for political opponents, communists, socialists, trade unionists. But over the years, it had expanded into something far worse. By 1944, it was a sprawling complex of death and suffering, housing tens of thousands of prisoners who were worked, starved, and tortured with industrial efficiency. Leopold was 63 years old when he arrived at Dachau. He had survived the collapse of an empire, the destruction of a movement, and 6 years of Nazi occupation. Now he faced the ultimate test. Elisabeth waited at home, not knowing if she would ever see him again. There was nothing she could do, no strings to pull, no favours to call in, no amount of money that could buy his freedom. She was helpless in a way she had never been before, not even during the custody battle, not even during the darkest days of her marriage. At least then, she had been able to fight. Now, she could only wait. The months crawled by. Winter came, harsh and cold. The war ground on. Vienna was bombed repeatedly by Allied aircraft, reducing whole neighbourhoods to rubble. Food was scarce. Fuel was scarcer. The city that had once been the glittering capital of an empire was now a grey, starving ruin. And still no word of Leopold. Then, in April 1945, American forces reached Dachau. What they found there shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. Thousands of corpses stacked like cordwood. Survivors who looked like living skeletons, barely able to stand. The full horror of what the Nazis had built was finally exposed to the world. Leopold Petznek was among the survivors. He had endured 8 months in that hell. 8 months of starvation, of forced labour, of watching men die around him every day, and he was barely alive. But he was alive. When he finally made his way back to Vienna, back to Elisabeth, it must have seemed like a miracle. They had been together for 24 years by then, through dictatorship and war and occupation and unimaginable horror. They had never been able to marry, had never been able to live openly as husband and wife. They had simply endured, holding on to each other through everything the world threw at them. But their ordeal wasn't quite over yet. When they returned to the villa in Hütteldorf, they found it occupied by soldiers. First, the Soviets had come, ransacking the property and taking whatever they wanted. Then, the French took over. Vienna had been divided into occupation zones, like Berlin, and Hütteldorf fell within the French sector. General Émile Betoit, the commander of French forces in Austria, requisitioned the villa as his headquarters. Elisabeth and Leopold were thrown out of their own home. For nearly 10 years, they lived in temporary accommodations, waiting for the occupation to end. It wasn't until 1955, when Austria finally regained its sovereignty with the signing of the State Treaty, that they were able to return to the villa. By then, they had been waiting long enough. Leopold was 74. Elisabeth was 71. Both were in poor health, worn down by decades of struggle. But they had one piece of unfinished business to attend to. On May 4th, 1948, Elisabeth and Leopold finally got married. It had taken 27 years. 27 years of living together, fighting together, surviving together. And now At last they could make it official. Elisabeth's divorce from Otto had been finalised just weeks earlier, and Leopold's wife had died in the psychiatric hospital back in 1935. There were no more obstacles, no more legal barriers, no more reasons to wait. The ceremony was simple: a civil service at a registry office in Vienna. No grand cathedral, no imperial pomp, no aristocratic guests. Just two elderly people who had chosen each other over everything else the world had to offer. For Elisabeth, it must have been a moment of profound vindication. She had given up a throne for love once before, and it had ended in disaster. Now she had done it again, and this time it was right. They had 8 years together as husband and wife.